The first thing I noticed was the smell of fresh paint. It hit me the moment I stepped out of the front door early Saturday morning with a cup of coffee in my hand. Sharp, chemical, and impossible to ignore. I looked down at my driveway and froze. Bright yellow parking lines stretched across the concrete from one edge to the other, perfectly straight and freshly painted. 4 parking spaces on my driveway. For a moment I just stood there, staring, trying to process what I was seeing. My driveway was wide, sure, but it was still my private property, part of the house I had bought 2 months ago. Yet someone had painted parking slots like it was a grocery store parking lot. The paint was still wet enough to shine in the morning sunlight. A small wooden sign had been pushed into the grass near the edge of the driveway. I walked over and read it. HOA Community Visitor Parking Permit Required. I let out a slow breath and rubbed my forehead. This had to be a joke. A bad prank, maybe. But deep down, I already knew who was responsible. The HOA. I walked back inside and grabbed my property documents from the kitchen table, flipping through the deed and the property map. The driveway was clearly marked as part of my lot. No shared access, no community easement, no visitor parking. Private property. I stepped back outside and took pictures of everything, the painted lines, the sign, the wet paint, and the entire driveway from multiple angles. Something told me I would need proof. Around noon, a black SUV pulled up in front of the house. I didn't even need to look twice to recognize it. Karen Mitchell stepped out, wearing her usual blazer and holding a clipboard like a badge of authority. She walked up the driveway, carefully stepping between the fresh yellow lines. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said with a polite smile. I crossed my arms and nodded toward the paint. "Want to explain this?" She glanced around proudly. "The HOA has designated this area as visitor parking for the community." I stared at her. "This is my driveway." She shook her head gently. "It's part of the neighborhood layout." I pulled out my phone and showed her the property map. "It's part of my lot." She barely looked at it. "The HOA board approved the change last week." I laughed in disbelief. "You approved painting my driveway without permission?" Her smile tightened. "It's for community convenience." I stepped closer. "You painted on private property." She lifted her chin slightly. "The community needs additional visitor parking, and your driveway is ideally located near the main entrance." I shook my head slowly. "That doesn't give you the right to take it." Karen's tone became firmer. "You live in an HOA community, Mr. Carter. That means shared responsibility. Not shared ownership," I replied. She tapped her clipboard. "Residents will begin using these spaces immediately." "No, they won't." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "They will." I pointed at the sign. "You need to remove that and clean this paint off my driveway." Karen shook her head. "That won't be happening." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Then I'll remove it myself." Her smile returned, colder this time. "If you tamper with HOA property, you will face fines." I laughed again. "HOA property? Why?" "You painted my concrete." Karen stepped back and adjusted her blazer. "Visitor parking enforcement begins tomorrow morning." "Enforcement?" I repeated. She nodded. "Vehicles parked without permits will be towed." I blinked. "On my driveway?" "Community visitor parking area," she corrected. I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't tow cars from my property." She smiled like she already knew the outcome. "We'll see." Then she turned and walked back to her SUV, leaving me standing there surrounded by yellow parking lines on my own driveway. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about what she said. Visitor parking enforcement begins tomorrow morning. Tow trucks. It sounded insane, but something about her confidence made me uneasy. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, I heard engines outside. Multiple engines. I rushed to the window and looked out. 3 tow trucks were pulling up in front of my house. My stomach dropped as they parked along the curb and the drivers stepped out, walking toward my driveway with tow hooks and paperwork in their hands. The tow truck drivers walked up the driveway like they had done this 100 times before. One of them looked at the yellow parking lines and nodded approvingly. Another checked a clipboard and pointed at my car, which was parked in the center of my driveway. I stepped outside quickly. "Stop right there." The drivers turned toward me. "Can I help you?" one of them asked calmly. I pointed at my car. "You're not towing anything from this driveway." The driver flipped through his paperwork. "We received an HOA request for unauthorized vehicles parked in visitor spaces." I laughed in disbelief. "This is my driveway." He shrugged slightly. "We were told this is community visitor parking." I stepped closer and showed him my ID. "I live here." He hesitated. "Sir, we're just following the work order." Another driver spoke up. "HOA scheduled enforcement this morning." I shook my head. "That HOA doesn't own this driveway." Just then, Karen's black SUV pulled up behind the tow trucks. She stepped out, looking completely confident, like everything was going exactly as planned. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said to the drivers. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Carter, you are in violation of visitor parking regulations." I stared at her. "You called tow trucks on my house?" She nodded. "Unauthorized vehicle parked in visitor space." I pointed at the concrete. "This is my private property." She handed the drivers a document. "Proceed with towing." One of the drivers hesitated. "Ma'am, the homeowner says," Karen cut him off. "The HOA has authority over community property." I stepped forward. "Show them legal proof that this driveway belongs to the HOA." Karen's smile faded slightly. "That's not necessary." The driver looked uncomfortable now. "Ma'am, we need confirmation before towing a resident's vehicle." Karen's voice sharpened. "You were hired to do a job." I pulled out my phone and dialed. "I'm calling the police." Karen laughed lightly. "Go ahead." I stepped away and spoke to dispatch, explaining that tow trucks were attempting to remove my vehicle from private property without legal authority. The dispatcher said officers were on the way. Karen rolled her eyes. "You're wasting everyone's time." 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. An officer stepped out and walked toward us. "What's going on here?" Karen spoke first. "HOA enforcement of visitor parking." I stepped forward and handed him my property documents. "This is my driveway." The officer studied the paperwork and then looked at the painted lines. "Who painted these?" Karen answered confidently. "The HOA." The officer raised an eyebrow. "On private property?" Karen hesitated for the first time. The tow truck drivers stepped back slightly, clearly unsure now. The officer looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, you can't authorize towing from private property without legal ownership or a court order." Karen's confidence began to crack. But then she said something unexpected. "The sheriff approved this enforcement." The officer frowned. "The sheriff?" Karen nodded. "Yes." Just then, another vehicle turned the corner and pulled up in front of the house. A county sheriff's truck. The engine shut off and the sheriff stepped out, looking directly at the painted parking lines on my driveway. Karen's confident smile returned. She crossed her arms and said quietly, "Now you're in trouble." The sheriff began walking toward us, holding a thick file in his hand.